So welcome everyone to the Conscious Governance live stream strategic planning series, and this is the second module of our 7-module series, and this module is about how to remain competitive and successful with some simple scenario planning. Now, the question that's often asked is, well, why should we be doing scenario planning? And the whole purpose behind scenario planning is to look at what are the potential, possible, maybe perhapses that the future might throw at us. And so good scenario planning is always about looking at what are the most unlikely but possible and sensitive but maybe situations that might occur that gives us insight into what we might need to put in place, that if they were to occur, our strategic plan is that much more robust. So that's what we're going to spend this short amount of time talking about, and I've got some really good examples of one way of going about it. So to recap, in our first module we've talked about vision and visioning and how to develop up a vision statement that actually works, and more importantly how to use it so that we know that it's adding strategic value. This time what I want to talk about as part of the process that we use in strategic planning is developing up some scenarios so that we are always actually looking at what the future might be. I mean, quite honestly, the key thing behind a strategic plan is that it has to be strategic, all right? And part of that is it needs to be looking at what might be into the future, not about creating the future that we want. If you try and create the future that you want, you will always be disappointed, because there's only one thing that we know about the future. It will be different than what we think it is at the moment. How will it be different? I don't know, but we do know it will be different. So we need to set up our strategic plan that can deal with whatever the future throws at us. And scenario planning is an amazingly effective way of doing this, but also can add value from an innovation perspective, and we'll show you that as this module goes on. So why we want to use scenario planning as part of our strategic planning facilitation is to get people out of the here and now and look at what potentially perhaps might be into the future, because that's where we need to be setting our strategy to deal with what might potentially could be happening, and developing it up in a way that it's getting us out of the here and the now. Now, all great words, what does that look like? Well, scenario planning is very simply a way of us looking at what might be, and then looking back now, what do we need to put in place if that were to occur? And there's different ways that you can do scenario planning. There's no one way of doing it. I'll give you some different examples, and then I'll show you the way that we go about doing it, which you can adapt to your own uses, because it's incredibly powerful and very quick. So, different things that you can do. Well, I was just talking with a large organisation this morning where the CEO was telling me that he had actually set up a scenario planning facilitation where the staff and the board were going to come up with 2 or 3 potential scenarios for the future based on the changes in their sector. So that's one way that you can do it. You can do it outside of the strategic planning session itself by developing up these scenarios. And there's ways of doing that. All I ask of you is that if you are going to get a facilitator to facilitate scenario planning, make sure you get a good one, because most of them aren't. So make sure that you're actually getting someone who understands really high level strategic scenario planning. Otherwise you're just wasting your time. So typically you can bring either someone from outside who's actually really good at facilitating scenario planning, or you can learn how to do it yourself. I've done many scenario plans when I was the CEO of my own organisations throughout my career. And the reason that I did it is because I enjoyed it and I actually am good at it. Why? Because you find out how to do these sorts of things. So you can spend some time developing up some scenarios. The second thing that you can do is that you can actually bring in a futurist to your strategic planning session and get them to talk about what do they see as the top 2 or 3 key drivers for the potential futures that we see. Fascinating stuff. You know, they're there for half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. And what they can do is actually challenge our thinking about what are some of these indicators of future change? What are some of these disruptive things that are occurring? You know, it's a popular term these days, disruptive technologies, disruptive organisations, disruptive thinking. Well, that's what we want to do as part of our strategic planning, is to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of same as last year, but a bit more. What we need to do is to challenge everything. So we either bring in already formed scenarios and talk about the implications of those scenarios for us, or we bring in someone like a futurist who can lead us through some of that discussion for 30 or 40 minutes to get us thinking outside of what we think we already know. The third thing that I find very useful, and this is what I want to spend most of this module talking about, is a way of actually doing your own scenario planning as part of the strategic planning day. And it's what we call possibility casting. What we're doing is that we're starting to look at the potential maybe, perhapses that might or might not happen, but if they were to happen, wow, some game changes might occur there. And there's some really cool techniques for doing this. So what I'm going to do is put up on the screen for you a sample matrix that you can use for possibility casting, and I'll lead you through the thinking behind this. Now, just right up front, this whole thing takes no more than about 40 or 50 minutes. So it's not a half day, it's not a full day. It's very focused, very powerful, very strategic, and I'll show you how to go about doing it. So here's the key matrix that you'll be using. See where it says science and technology is the first element, perception shaping events, new fringe ideas, and so on. And I'll lead you through each one of those. So don't forget, in our planning team, we have our board, our senior executives, and 2 or 3 key stakeholders. Each one of them knows slightly different things about the sector, about the industry, about the area that we're in. Some have technical knowledge, some have strategic knowledge, some have broad community knowledge. This is why we need to have a varied planning team. There's a number of ways you can do this. You can have it up on a whiteboard, which I find actually quite useful, and put the matrix up on the whiteboard, as well as having this on a computer that is connected to a projector and shining up either on a screen somewhere or a wall, so that people can actually see what's going on as we go about filling this matrix in. And literally what you do is you say, okay, so here is the business that we're in. Here's our sector, here's our organisation, here's our vision statement. What's happening right now in, let me take an example, homelessness, for example. What's happening right now in homelessness, because that's our sector, in science and technology as it impacts on the way we deal with the issues of homelessness. And then you shut up and people start to say, well, you know, the impact of social media. You know, did you know that the greatest uptake of mobile phones is amongst the homeless population? No, I didn't know that. Okay, so this connectivity is starting to change, right? The changing nature of some of the reasons why people become homeless, the mental health reasons are starting to change through the science and technology. We're starting to understand that more. What else is happening with science and technology as it impacts on right now? Right? You have no trouble filling this in. Right? Your biggest difficulty is going to be keeping people to time. So now, what could be happening in 5 years in science and technology as it impacts on homelessness? Well, there'll be new styles of housing potentially, there'll be new crisis accommodation, there'll be new ways of dealing with mental health. Exactly what? Don't know, but we know that these things will change because we see these changes starting to. So what could be happening in 5 years in science and technology? You know, the connectivity is changing totally. So put all those things down. Now, what could be happening in 10 years? Right? Get yourself out of the here and now. Not whether it will happen, but it might happen. Not whether it's good or bad, it might happen. We're not here to debate the moral values of it. It might happen. I'm not saying it will, it might. And this is the very essence of scenario planning. It's not about whether it will, it's that it might happen, potentially. So you start filling that in. You know, another example, take another organisation. We mentioned in one of the previous modules the Taxi Industry Association. So what's happening right now in science and technology as it impacts on the taxi industry? Now let's go back to the vision statement. The vision statement is about mobility and the spirit of community. Okay, so what is happening in science and technology as it impacts on these elements of our vision? What's happening in 5 years could potentially perhaps what could be in 10 years, right? So people are starting to get out of their comfort zones and to start looking at what might be. The next one is perception shaping events. Okay, so what is shaping society's perception about homelessness? What is shaping society's perception about your industry? If you're in the oil industry or energy industry, what's shaping society's perception about your industry? What's happening that shapes society's perception? Okay, now what could be happening in 5 years that shapes society's perception? And what could be happening in 10 years? You see how this works? The next one is new fringe ideas. And I always love this. When we do this with, we probably do this 40 times a year with 40 different organisations. The new fringe ideas, best way to describe that is, today's weird and wacky idea is tomorrow's iPad. You just never know. We need to understand what are these weird and wacky ideas. So what is happening in strange areas where you say, nah, that's not going to happen. That'll never happen here. So what's happening overseas in some of these areas? What's some of the things that are going out there we say, gee, that's a little off left field for what it is our sector's about? We need to know what these things are. So what are the new fringe ideas? What are the weird and wacky ideas out there about taxis, about mobility, about homelessness, about whatever it might be, whatever your sector is? Now, what are the weird and wacky ideas that might be in 5 years' time? Let's start thinking outside. And this is where you start to really value your external stakeholder input. We go back to who should be on your planning team: board, senior staff, and 2, 3, maybe 4 key external stakeholders. Those people whose points of view really matter to us, because they will add value to this, because they see life differently. And so you'll find that you have no trouble populating this at all. So what could be happening in 10 years with these fringe ideas, these weird and wackies? Economic developments is the next element. So what's happening in the economy as it impacts on whatever your sector is? What could be happening in 5 years? What could be happening in 10 years? Now, what personally I find really interesting with this sort of process is that you know that your board and your senior executives aren't necessarily terribly strategic if it's like listening to crickets in a closed room. There is no comment coming through. There's a lot of silence there, right? And so one of the things that this does is it also points out to our key leaders that, hey, maybe we should be keeping on top of some of these things. So economic developments, political developments, what's happening in the political arena right now as it impacts on whatever your sector is. Let's take health, for example. In the health sector in Australia, there's a big move now towards the NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is prefaced on the money follows the individual, not the program. So the implication of that is huge for the way these organisations actually set themselves up, and then the way they structure, the way they train their staff, the sort of programs they need to put in place. Fundamental game changer. The good organisations started talking about this 5 years ago when it was mooted as a potential. The organisations that might find themselves really struggling are those that are starting to look at it now as it's being implemented. So, political developments, what's happening now? What could be happening in 5 years? Might not. Could be, might not, that sort of thing. And then 10 years. And then the last one is what's happening in the environment, the natural environment, the gas, energy, water, land use, quality of food, what's happening in these environmental developments as it impacts on us. Now, 5 years, 10 years. Filling this out takes between 30 to 40 minutes tops, all right? And what you find is it's an amazingly powerful discussion. Your job is to make sure it doesn't get into rightness, wrongness, it will occur, it'll be terrible if it did occur. That's not the issue of this. What we need to do is to identify what might potentially, possibly could perhaps happen. So, at the end of 30 or 40 minutes, you've got this filled in, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And it's incredibly interesting and totally useless unless you start to use it. So literally what you do is you pick one at random from the column that says now. Pick one at random. Doesn't matter which area it comes from. One at random. And then you pick one at random from the next column, which is 5 years. And you pick one at random from the column that is 10 years. And you put those three things together and create a mini scenario. And then you say, now if that scenario were to occur, not saying it will, not saying it should, but if it were to occur, what would we need to put in place to deal with that? What are the implications behind that scenario if it were to occur? What are the trends that it shows? What are the different things that we may not have otherwise considered? That if that scenario were to occur, what would we need to put in place so we could leverage off that? It's very cool. So, let me show you an example of what that actually looks like. And this is a real life example. So, on your screen now is an example of this possibility casting with a great organisation called Sunraysia Rural Financial Counselling. And you'll see that we've filled it in there. You don't have to read all the detail in there, but this is what it looks like. This is literally a real life example. So we filled these things in. Science and technology. The first one there was the IT, the apps and the technology on farms is changing significantly. Okay, cool, let's put that in. Transport options are changing. Cool, let's put that in. Not whether it's good or bad, they're just changing. 5 years, 10 years and so on. So there's an example of a filled in one. So with this example from Sunraysia, we took one at random from each of these columns. So let's look at the first one. Let's look at the red ones first, okay? So the first one is lack of resources and services, which was one taken at random from the now column, together with increased costs, which is one at random that was taken from the second column, the 5-year column. And then the third one is demand changes. There's a change in demand, which was at random from the third one. So the scenario became, what if there was a lack of resources and services together with an increase in costs, together with a major change in demand? If those three things were to occur together, paint me a picture, tell me a story. Tell me what that would be like by telling me a story of that scenario. And then there's always someone in the group who can actually come up with a little story that demonstrates the key elements there. So if we had lack of resources and services, and we had an increase in costs, and we had a change in demand, what would that look like? What would the implications for us be? Now, if you look at the bottom of this, you'll see in red underneath here are the implications that they came up with. The key thing that they said, if this were to occur, there would be a greater emphasis on mental health, because this would be putting a lot of people under stress. It means that there'd be lack of resources, so trying to do more with less. There would also be an increase in cost, so there'd be the stress associated with that, and there'd be a huge change, so we've got to do more. So the big implication for us is a real change in the mental health of the people that we're working with, those that are on the farm, those that supply these sort of things through our rural services. So a huge emphasis on mental health. So what does that mean? Well, maybe into the future, going forward, we need, as an organisation, as the Rural Financial Counselling, to actually have even more emphasis on being resilient and to build into our programs the ability for the people that we work with, our farmers and their families and their communities, to actually help develop up even greater resiliency if this were to occur. Well, that makes sense, okay? And then the other thing is, maybe what we could do is actually place even more importance on change management, so that we actually bring that front and centre. Because if this scenario were to occur, and it's certainly possible, it's potential, it's maybe, it's perhaps, I'm not saying it will, but it could. If we put more importance on the change management process and getting our people, our families, our communities, understanding how they can change and how to manage that change, what does that look like, then the implications for us is we need to have an even greater emphasis on mental health, and in particular, the emphasis on creating resiliency and the emphasis on change management. All of a sudden, we're starting to give a different insight into who some of our key partners might be, who some of our key stakeholders might be, that we could actually start to do this work together in advance of needing to. So if this scenario were to come to fruition, there's a greater emphasis needed on mental health, and therefore we need to start positioning ourselves to deal with that now. Power of scenario planning. And it makes sense. Even if it weren't to come to pass, it's still a good thing to do. Now, let's take a second example. Second example, same thing. Let's look at the green ones. So the green ones were balance EA changes the mix. Now, I can't remember what balance EA means, but it meant something to the group. Together with changes in banking systems, together with being a product for the world, not just for our community, but we actually are providing products for the world through our work that we're doing on the farms, through work we're doing on our production in our rural and regional communities. So if we had this balance, EA changes the mix, together with changes in banking, together with we're actually creating product for the world, paint me a picture, tell me a story. What would that look like? And sure enough, someone came up with a story that actually explored that. Now, don't forget, the reason we're doing this is not to come up with a story. It's to get people to start looking at potentially what might be into the future. And what do we need to put in position now so that if it were to occur, we're in good shape. And even if it didn't occur, we're in good shape because we've started thinking outside of the square. We're positioning ourselves in advance of needing to. So what this one actually showed them, exploring this, and it only took a few minutes, is that there's an increased scope for our counsellors to actually further develop enterprises that actually help our farmers deal with some of the changes that might occur. Product for the world, changes in banking, and changing our mix. What are some of these enterprises that we as counsellors can help start developing up that actually help get some of our farmers and the farming community being able to deal with this? These are the implications behind looking at some of these scenarios. Now, each one of you will have different elements that go into your matrices. Each one of you will come up with the different stories, and each one of you will come up with different implications. But can you see what this does? It stretches us. It helps us to actually become more strategic by looking at what might be into the future and what do we need to position now. I mean, it takes me back to the very definition of what do we mean by being strategic. I think you'll enjoy this. Being strategic is constantly looking at what's happening out there now and into the future. What, if anything, does it mean to us? And then what, if anything, do we need to do about it? What's happening out there now and into the future? What does it mean to us? And what do we need to do about it? And doing this constantly. What's happening out there now and into the future? This scenario planning gives you an indication of what might be happening out there into the future. Now, what, if anything, does it mean to us? Which is why we look at the implications behind this. And then what, if anything, do we need to do about it? We then feed this into our strategic plan to see if our strategies are actually able to deal with these two implications. So what happened with Sunraysia, for example, is when we developed up their 5 key strategies, then we mapped them against, does this help us deal with some of the emphasis on mental health? One of our strategies actually has that as one of the action plans, so we've covered off on that. And as part of that, one of their strategies was developing up new enterprises in different ways by looking at what other entities, what other countries had been doing in this area, coming up with new innovative ways of developing enterprises that would actually help our farming community. One of the strategies dealt with that, and that dealt with that particular implication from that scenario plan. So the whole notion of scenario planning is, again, looking at what might potentially could perhaps be into the future. Now, what, if anything, does it mean to us? And now, what, if anything, do we need to do about it? It's a very, very cool way of actually using a short amount of time, 40 minutes, 50 minutes tops, to actually develop up some key scenarios and then look at, most importantly, what are the strategic implications for us and what would we need to put in place to deal with these. One of the great things about this scenario planning and this possibility casting process that I've taken you through is that it has a shelf life of about 3 years, which means that you can actually use it over and over again. Don't forget, those people who were involved in developing this up were some of the best of the best. You had your board, your senior executives, and some of your key stakeholders involved in this. So let's use it over and above just the strategic planning day. So what I always recommend to the CEOs in particular is that if you were to sit down with your senior execs every 6 months and do 2 more scenarios like we did here, one at random from now, one at random from 5, one at random from 10 years, develop that up. What are the implications behind this if it were to occur? Now let's map that against some of our key programs to see if it identifies areas that we could get into that we haven't got into. How we can use some of our existing programs and services and leverage off them even more by positioning ourselves to take into account potential possible scenarios and doing this in advance of needing to. Fantastic way of doing it. And I would do maybe 2 scenarios every 6 months and map them against 1 or 2 of your key projects or programs. And I guarantee what will come up from that is new ways of looking at how you can leverage off existing alliances, leverage off developing up new innovative ways of taking that program or service even further, and more importantly, amongst all of that, looking at potential new revenue streams that come from it. So please use it. As I said, it's got a shelf life of about 3 years. Incredibly powerful. It will take you literally half an hour to an hour every 6 months with your senior team. Why wouldn't you? But you've got to use it. So let me just summarize what I've been talking about here. This whole notion of scenario planning is a stretch for most people. But then again, that's why we do strategic planning. I'm sorry, but your strategic plan has to actually be, that's right, strategic. So to do that, we need to look at what might be into the future and then bring it back to now what does that mean for us, and now what, if anything, do we need to do about that? And scenario planning, whether you use internally developed scenarios and bring those to the planning day, whether you use a futurist or someone like that to help stretch your thinking about what some of the disruptors might be into the future, what the implications for us might be, or whether you actually use this process that we've been talking about that we find incredibly powerful, which is the possibility casting. The whole purpose of this is to get people outside of the here and the now, to actually be strategic. And so when you first start doing this, play with it. Maybe if you don't want to do it at your strategic planning meeting, try it with some of your staff. You know, get used to the process behind it. But once you've started using this, you will find it is one of the most powerful, innovative tools and strategic positioning tools that you can possibly come across if you use it. Using this style of scenario planning will keep you both competitive and ahead of the game, innovative, but what you're doing is just looking at what might be into the future and looking at what it means now. It doesn't matter what words you use for it, but it is the way of being. It is your way of actually creating your organisation to be incredibly successful by looking at the strategic implications of what might be in advance of needing to, which is the very definition of strategic. I wish you well. So we hope you've enjoyed this module, and don't forget there's 6 other modules that go alongside with this to give you a different way of doing strategic planning. One that you can do in one day, and one that is actually truly strategic, that we've had many hundreds of CEOs and boards say is the most effective way they've ever found a strategic plan and a facilitation for strategic planning that makes a real difference. So have a look at these modules, and we invite you to either contact us if you'd like to work with us. The details for that are below, and certainly to have a look at all the other modules as part of this series.